Hello and welcome to the KPI Institute's webinar, Building a KPI System. My name is Andrei Kostia and I will be your host for today, along with our presenter, Eric Peterson. Today's webinar will showcase how you can discover and unleash the real value in your data, as well as understand how you should plan for and design an effective KPI system. It will be delivered by Eric Peterson, Innovation Manager at Corporator. Eric has more than 11 years of experience with Corporator, where he and his team use their product expertise to bring business ideas to life within the Corporator Business Management Platform. He has also been a speaker at numerous industry events throughout the world. This presentation lasts between 30 to 45 minutes. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have during the webinar, as they will be answered at the end of the presentation in our Q&A session. Enjoy the KPI Institute and Corporator's webinar, Building a KPI System. Now, I would like to invite Eric to begin his presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Eric Peterson. I'm the Innovation Manager at Corporator, a software company. I would say that my job deals half with technology and half with business. And my focus is on bridging those two, but I will try to keep this webinar focused on business so that it makes sense to people. I've worked with all sorts of companies throughout the world, so my topics today are taken from a wide variety of influences that I've experienced with working in the field, and I'll try to be practical more than theoretical. All right, so let's get started. This is our agenda today. It's a bit ambitious to get through in our time slot. My focus is about building a KPI system, and I think we'll go through these points in more detail, of course. But before we begin, I just want to talk a bit about how we might define what a KPI system is, what it is and how it's used. And I think one way to look at it is, if you look at it really closely, it just looks like a measurement system. It's a collection of metrics. I know that a lot of employees don't necessarily like KPI systems because they feel that they're being controlled or monitored in some way. But rather than taking a really close-up look at a KPI system, let's just step back a minute, and it starts to look more like this. If we look at how and why they are used, if we look at the business value they deliver, their purpose, the business language they speak, it's much more than a measurement system. And a KPI becomes much more than a number. A KPI system becomes much more than data. I really believe this should be about telling stories. And I think to tell a story, it needs to be wrapped up in some sort of context. And we'd like to call that a business framework. And the business framework can be something like strategy management, or it can be balanced scorecard. That's a whole framework for managing with using metrics. It could be some discipline within risk management or governance or compliance. And since we start talking business, it's not just numbers anymore. And we also want these KPIs to help us do something. We want them to help us make an impact on the business. So we don't just want to measure performance, we want to move performance in a certain direction. And this direction is usually defined by the framework. This could be coming from the strategy, or maybe you have some sort of continuous improvement or quality improvement framework. You want to reduce defects, for instance, or reduce the cost of non-quality. That framework gives you a direction. Or maybe if you're into some sort of a health and safety KPI, you're looking at reducing injuries or accidents or incidents, that sort of thing. But you get the idea. You have a business framework that steers you or guides you in a certain direction. So with that as kind of a background, we're going to talk a little bit more about the system side of things. How to build the KPI system and why that is even a topic. And I think to begin with, we need to look at the current state of KPI systems, and we tend to find that a lot of KPI projects fail. There's a statistic that says that 70% of business intelligence projects do not deliver value back to the business. They don't make a business impact. Now, of course, if you're listening carefully, you heard me say business intelligence projects. And I think this is significant because, as we'll discuss, most KPI projects are attempted to be delivered as a business intelligence project if it uses technology. So if it's using some sort of business intelligence tools such as dashboards or spreadsheets or some sort of stack of technology. And we'll take a look at why these projects often don't meet the needs of business. And I think maybe to offer a practical example, we can look at this slide. I've protected the guilty here, but this came from a tender from a company that was looking to replace an existing solution. So it's a mature company. They were mature enough that they had a system in place, and they wanted to replace it, and because they had some challenges. So if we take a closer look here, we can see that this is not a company that's new to KPIs or new to systems, and this document is the result of a hard lesson learned, an expensive exercise in a project that didn't give them the results that they needed. And if we ask the question why, we can start to see in how this is written that their system is not flexible enough. It's too rigid. It lacks agility. And from there, the problem starts to cascade. Because they have a lack of agility, then they're dependent on support from the supplier to make even minor adjustments to the system. And of course, this is very costly to the customer. But also, I mean, I think we should expect that if you have a KPI system, it should be in a constant state of adjustment. I mean, this isn't like a budgeting system or an ERP system that covers a rather fixed set of processes or business structures. I mean, we're talking about a performance management system that's going to be in a constant state of evolution. I mean, there's going to be changing business conditions. There's going to be changing planning cycles. Maybe the business gets, the strategy is restructured or something like that. But it's in a constant state of change. And then another final point that we see in here is that the software that this customer was using wasn't really integrated with other aspects of performance management. So I think another way of looking at this is, a lot of the software you'll find today is fundamentally designed wrong for meeting the needs of business in KPIs. So with that as a background, this is kind of the basic focus that I want to go into more detail with, and to discuss how solutions are designed in these areas, how that can be problematic, and touch upon how they should be designed. So we'll touch upon the difference between a technology stack and a solution. We'll go into the issues of and importance of change and agility. We'll talk about a holistic view of performance rather than just using point solutions, and then talk about some of the capabilities that a good solution needs for meeting the needs of business. All right, the first point. We'll talk a bit about technology versus a solution and what is the difference. I guess the way I see it, technology is kind of like an ingredient inside a solution. So if we think of something like an ingredients, like in our daily lives in your own kitchen, you might have flour, for instance. You can buy flour, and if you're really, really hungry, you might want to eat it. But I mean, it's not something you would normally eat on its own. You use it to bake a cake, or you make a pizza. You can make, any number of things with flour, but you wouldn't normally go to a restaurant and order it off the menu as a finished meal. It becomes more valuable and useful when it is combined with other ingredients. And that's really how I see technology, is that it's usually something that needs to be combined with something else, that on its own it's unfinished. It's not like a complete meal. And the technology stack ends up creating some different gaps in meeting these kind of business needs. What we often see here is that they're based on a data warehouse approach. And we've seen this in many customers where they have a very strong IT department. We'll have these kind of meetings beforehand, and we'll have these discussions, and they tend to be a bit philosophical or theoretical, but a lot of these organizations have a mandate where they want to have like a single source of truth. They want to have a very central, controlled data warehouse. And you talk to the IT department, and they will tell me that, you know, maybe 70 to 90% of the critical information that managers need is in the data warehouse. But when they leave the room and I'm speaking with business, and they're the ones who actually need this information, they might report something like maybe 30% of their needed information is in the data warehouse. And that's a huge gap, and that's just in the data alone. We're not even talking about the functional gap. But if you have a very centralized way of trying to control data, there's often a big gap with what managers need. So managers tend to fill in those gaps with all sorts of spreadsheets, or maybe some local homegrown band-aids to get them by, you know, maybe some a database here or something in Access, or, you know, some little tools, files, spreadsheets, whatever. Often they don't really tell IT how they're working around them, but they're trying to fill in those gaps. The other issue I think that you kind of see is that, you know, the technology stacks tend to really focus on visualizing data. And it's usually through structured data. Usually the intention is to provide some sort of data insights and to allow users to explore through the data and so on. But what we often see and hear from customers is that if they have insights and they don't have ways of linking actions to them or ways of linking accountability to them, those insights don't mean very much. You know, that we can have all the insights in the world and how to solve a problem, but unless you do something about it, nothing will change. And many of these technology stacks result in these kinds of performance reporting systems that if you want to do something about it, if you want to move or transform performance, you have to handle those activities outside of the system. And then it becomes quite a challenge to be able to link everything back up together in one system so that they know, you know, what is our performance, what are our KPIs, what's the framework it's linked to, what are we doing to improve performance. They don't have those kind of linkages because they just end up with tables of metrics. And so this is where some of this critical missing functionality comes in. And that's what we're talking about, adding these other two boxes, you know, where we have a business framework, and that's the blue box. And that's a way to model some of the management elements, and that gives the system, or that gives some users some sort of context for understanding the data or for working with the data. So this can be something like the balanced scorecard framework, where metrics are organized and linked together in categories or perspectives or under objectives in ways that make them more meaningful. Or it could be some other sort of framework like EFQM, which is a quality framework, or there can be a compliance framework. There's a lot of different frameworks in the financial industry, for instance. Or it can be some sort of continuous improvement framework like Lean or Six Sigma or something like that. And of course, there's governance, risk, benefit realization models. I mean, there's countless frameworks for performance management, for different aspects, different domains in performance management. Or some of these could even be for individual performance, like employee performance or team performance and that sort of thing. But if you don't have a framework, all you really have is just a list of KPIs. And if you just have that kind of list of KPIs, your users don't really have a clear understanding of their purpose or how they should be used. If we move down to that to the orange box, we're talking about process and execution. I would say that this layer is more about making KPIs actionable. And this can be at many different levels. I mean, on one hand, it could be about planning for performance improvement. It can be about monitoring initiatives or action plans for improving or correcting performance. Another, I think, a really key piece is having some way of assigning accountability or responsibility for these actions. Setting timelines. I mean, it's one thing to just create these to-do lists, but if you don't start to put some timelines on it, a lot of stuff will just never get done. Maybe build in some prioritization mechanisms. Sometimes even just putting this stuff into a framework for having management meetings. So these things are discussed, reviewed, and so on by management. But it could be any number of things. But the point is that it has some business process support that works in with what management needs. And most of these pure technology platforms don't really have anything that supports this kind of process or execution framework, so that any of these types of activities need to be done outside the system. All right. I think the second point here, we're talking about change and agility. And if you base your solution on a data warehouse approach or on a data-centric approach, your business logic usually ends up getting locked to the structure of the data warehouse. And what we find is that data warehouses are really excellent for structured data, but there's always going to be exceptions. And these exceptions can be from a variety of reasons. I mean, you might have some business unit that was recently acquired, so it's not really part of the centralized data structure yet. Or maybe you have a remote office. Their fiscal year starts in April and everybody else it starts in October. Or maybe you have some office, maybe like a German office. They can't use the same HR system as everybody else due to some data protection laws. Or there's a new business unit that's not yet integrated. So, some of these might be just very practical ways that there are exceptions to the system, that the data is not available. Others might just be more, I guess, local. Like, let's say you have a new manager and you want to have a different set of expectations, different targets, something like that. Or maybe for some financial reporting reason, you have some data that doesn't roll up. It's not supposed to roll up the same way as everything else. But the point is, there are always exceptions in the real world. This idea that all your performance data is going to be structured in tables and everything's going to be neat and orderly, I've never seen it in reality. And customers have a real need for dealing with these exceptions and ways of combining this kind of structured data that's already there, but they might need to roll in some data that comes from a manual input somewhere. Or maybe 90% of a roll-up comes from an ERP system, but we got this one little corner that we need to get in there. It needs to come from a spreadsheet. And this can be really messy if this is really starting to define the business logic in a KPI system, because exceptions are just always going to be there. Agility is also important in other levels as well, because sometimes you're going to need to show different KPIs differently as needed. Like, I mean, some of this is just really obvious, but like financial KPIs might have things like targets and forecasts. but you're not going to have targets and forecasts for accidents or injuries. Well, you probably have targets. You're not going to have budgets and forecasts for injuries, for instance. So you might have different views, different data points, etc., for different types of KPIs. So you need to be able to visualize different KPIs differently. The processes behind these need to be agile. It's not just a visualization, but a lot of times there's business rules that need to be dynamic, and we want things. I would say you want as much of your business logic or your business rules and your KPIs to be reusable when you need them. I think a way to think about this, it just comes down to simple math. But if you have something really basic, well, let's just say we have 30 KPIs and 30 business units, your issue for maintaining them multiplies. I mean, if you multiply 30 times 30, I mean, you have 900 KPIs to manage. And sometimes you're going to want to treat these KPIs globally, so that you can edit, one KPI and it's reflected in all 30 business units. That's fantastic. That makes it very efficient, easy to maintain. But other times you might need to individually or locally edit these things on a single business unit, for instance. So you kind of need the best of both worlds. You need to be able to individually, locally control these KPIs, or you might need to globally edit many of them, for all business units at the same time. And moving on to number 3, we'll talk a bit about holistic performance. What does that really mean? And I touched upon it a bit already, but we're talking about linking multiple functional domains together. I would say that they're linked in reality in your business. So they should also be linked in the solution. And often these domains are kind of glued together with strategy. But I think to take a better look at it, this diagram, I think, illustrates it a bit better. It looks something like this. I mean, you have projects and finance and risks and quality, HR, operations, and so on. These are pretty typical buckets that most companies deal with functionally. And you can't really reach your goals if you don't have the right people, for instance. So HR is a critical piece. But you also need to have the right investments, and you have to have the right ways of setting the goals and targets, and that's ultimately defined by the strategy. You might look at what's keeping you from reaching your goals. Those might be your risks. You might look at what you need to do. What do we need to do to reach our goals? And they might be defined or mapped out in your portfolio of projects or initiatives. But you get the idea. And the thing is, I think that many KPI systems are basically like point solutions or parts of point solutions. And by a point solution, what I mean is it's kind of a standalone solution. And what I find today is that the whole concept of a KPI has really become a generic concept. Even Excel, if you go into Excel, you'll see that there's an object called a KPI. But what is it? I mean, in Excel, it's just a row in a table. And we need KPIs that are richer than that. Businesses need to add some commentary, some evaluation. They want to show the history. They want to show how maybe the KPIs are linked to objectives, maybe how the objectives are linked to initiatives and risks. And here's where you start to get into the storytelling behind the KPIs, of actually showing performance through many different lenses and through multiple levels, maybe. Not just organizationally, but maybe you're going to have a strategic view, a tactical view, operational view. But I think coming back to this, if we just use Excel as an example, I mean, I've seen a lot of customers that use Excel in some way to manage KPIs, but they generally don't use the KPI object inside of Excel for managing performance, which I find very interesting. It's generally they just build up tables. And you quickly see that Excel starts to fall apart when you try to show the history of performance, because you really don't have any navigation. You kind of have to show everything on one page. And then as you show more and more data on one page, it's really hard for people to focus or know what parts, what slices they need to focus on, and it goes on and on. All right, and moving on, we'll talk a little bit about capability. Does the solution have what business truly needs? I would say in our company, our effort has been to decode business, where we offer tools to measure, to collect data, to assess, approve, analyze, publish, and so on. And we've broken it up across multiple management domains. And while these are really broad categories, they can even be broken down even further into these kind of building blocks that represent functionality. And I think it's really important that people think about, when they're looking at a KPI system, what are all of the purposes, what are all of the business needs behind a KPI? Because, a lot of systems really focus on that kind of top-ish sort of layer there of measuring. They just want to measure performance. And I think there's a lot more to it, or you can get a lot more business value out of it if you start to link these into other management domains, if you build in other areas of functionality and really start to tell stories around these and let people really understand not just what their performance is, but to give them, the kind of roadmap, help them understand the resources and the path for improving performance and for making things better. But let's take a closer look at capability. And I'm just going to use this as an example here. We'll talk a bit about report automation first, because I think this is a good example. I mean, every customer has, or every company has some sort of reporting process that goes on. And I think that companies have all sorts of fancy tools for dealing with reports and data and dashboards and so on, with the idea, I come into some of these huge companies and I expect that they have this really automated reporting process, and I find that it's still very, very manual. A lot of people still rely heavily on spreadsheets, or cutting and pasting elements from a variety of tools into a Word document or a PowerPoint. And I think the problem just starts to cascade. I worked with a bank for a bit where I think it was probably a full-time job if you added up all the hours just to prepare for the management meeting report. And the process for this bank really involved a bunch of managers that were cutting and pasting content into a report that was emailed around. And in the emails, they would add some personal comments, and the meeting owner would take these reports and they would, manually have to add up the sums of these key figures and put them into tables and connect charts and graphs to the tables. But of course, what would happen is either somebody would be late in submitting the data, or at the last minute there would be some last minute change to the data, and then all the total figures would need to be updated, and those updates would need to be reflected in the charts and graphs. And after a couple iterations of updates, you can see what a mess it is in maintaining this and keeping everything current. So it was hugely time consuming. I came across this statistic that maybe it's 85 hours per report, but I believe it's actually higher. I think this is a low estimate. But I have no doubt that up to 95% of reports are still using this kind of cut and paste approach, at least at some level. But I think it just kind of shows that a lot of these solutions and systems for management reporting, for KPI reporting, don't have the full capability, the full reach, whether it's because they can't see the data, whether it's because the data is not available. I mean, there can be any number of reasons, but the technology and the promise of automation often falls short in reality. And I think one of the key reasons behind this might be based on this kind of report concept. I mean, if we look at this is a report, and a lot of organizations have these digitalization initiatives where they want to automate everything, they want to digitalize everything. Reporting still is a very cumbersome process. And I think part of it is because the BI professionals, the IT people, they see things a bit differently. I mean, their focus is on charts and tables. I mean, that's what a report is. For them, it looks more like this. They don't really focus on the content around this, the evaluation, the soft metrics, the things that are not in the data warehouse. I mean, for most reports, those are things that are manually pasted in later, and IT is just taking this kind of narrow view, and in a way, they've kind of left the business. The business really needs that kind of evaluative information, the narrative, the story, and the charts and graphs are really there to support the story as evidence, but they're not the story. They're just kind of the backup evidence to help it. I mean, we should probably have a diagram that kind of flips this around and shows what the managers really need. But this is kind of the narrow lens that IT often looks at things. So how should a KPI system be built? I think one of the key areas here is to maybe talk about a few things or a few ways where they should not be built, and I think that's the design that traditional dashboards use, where they have this kind of filter-based approach. These again are very data-driven designs. They're really based on data and filters, and they're a series of flat reports. There's no real model here. There's no real framework. There's no navigation. It's just a matter of changing these kind of filters. And I think this is where a good KPI system comes in, because it starts to show you the context. It gives you the business unit, the reporting period, the navigation. It organizes metrics in ways that they can be categorized, like in perspectives or objectives and so on. And they can be linked out to where they need to in the model. The KPIs also can exist as both rows and tables, but they can also have their own pages, so they can start to tell their own story. And they can show a more comprehensive view of performance rather than just showing an actual and a target value and a status light. I mean, you can drill into it and see much more. So what we typically do as we get into the capability part is we kind of break things down into this kind of wheel where we need the data as evidence. We need some analytics so that we can explore, we can get some insights. We have some process support, and we have a business model or a framework that just kind of glues everything together. And I'll just run through these briefly, and then I'll just jump into a very brief demo of how this can look in practice, and then we can move on to some questions. To start with, we've discussed the data a bit. Again, though, I think we need to recognize that data needs to include more than what's in the data warehouse. It needs to include, evaluative information, commentary, and so on. We have the analytics model, processes to make it happen, and then the business model to glue it together. So in more detail with the data as evidence, some of this stuff, is going to be unstructured. I would say that this diagram here, for the data hub really isn't to scale. I think a lot of times the unstructured data might be actually more important to business than some of the structured data. Usually the most structured data kind of follows things like financial data and things like that. And there's already very clearly well-defined reporting systems and accounting systems and so on already set up for that. But where it starts to get interesting is trying to make sense out of this unstructured data. But again, this is really about creating a base of evidence for decision making and for prioritization, even for target setting and so on. But of course, those processes generally come through in analytics, where you start to explore the data, where you're looking at, how can we use this data? What can we do with this? Where are our opportunities? Where do we have room for improvement? How much improvement should we expect, and so on. So that's really where the analytics side comes in. And again, there are some fantastic tools out there for analytics. I'm sure a lot of people are already using these types of tools. But what we can also do with a system like ours is we can embed these kind of third-party analytics tools inside our system, so that we kind of wrap things up inside a business framework. We give things more of a process support and so on. But again, this is analytics. If we move on to processes, this really is about, how can we make things happen? How can we reach our goals? We can't just ask employees to perform better and faster and more efficiently if we don't give them a plan. We don't give them a means to meet those kind of performance gaps. I think it's just bad for employee psychology if we just expect people to do better, but we don't give them some sort of tools for helping them work better. So part of this is motivational, and part of it is practical. But again, it's about including the means for improving performance. It includes some sort of process execution framework and so on. And then we have the framework itself, and we've, I think, discussed this enough already in this webinar. But again, this is about it can be part of the management domains, it can be the business rules, it can be kind of the structure, if you will, for evaluating performance. And these should somehow be baked into a KPI system itself. And then you have a context for understanding the results. You have an understanding of how you should be analyzing data. You have an understanding for how you should prioritize, etc. So it really starts to provide the foundation for how performance should be evaluated. All right, I am going to just jump out of this for a moment, and I'm going to just show a brief demo, and then we'll move on to some questions. But hopefully in the demo you can see some practical ways of how this stuff fits together. All right, I think I'm just going to move out of here to just start here at a landing page. From a very practical standpoint, when we work with customers in designing some sort of KPI solution, one of the things that we try to do is make the solution as visual as possible. We try to make things as easy to use as possible. I think there's a lot of solutions that really kind of look like Excel, and they kind of behave like Excel. We try to make things a bit more intuitive, so it really is more like a website. I mean, here we're in a web browser, so it functions like a website. We have a menu for navigation. We have a way to navigate through time, and we have a breadcrumb that tells us where we are and where it gives us a way of navigating as well. But if we go in to something like strategy, this is where we start talking a little bit about this framework that we talked about earlier, where we just kind of bake it right in. We talk about the purpose, why do we exist? We have metrics categorized, in terms of, where are we heading? These might be kind of the broad categories of metrics. We kind of break this down into different layers, tactically and operationally. And we also have these kind of key figures. So rather than bombarding a user right when they log in with 30 or 40 different metrics and a whole bunch of lights, these might be our key figures where we can see this is in the green, 5.3%, etc. These are the highlights. These are the things to focus on. So we don't just overwhelm them with information. And we can also have other navigation charts and graphs and so on here. But this can give like a really high level view. And of course, we can start to drill into these and take a closer look. So here we're going into an objective. And this is where, again, we're still talking about organizing content very clearly in some sort of framework. Our objective here has a list of KPIs. So we've got, I don't know, what 5 KPIs here. But they're also linked together with improvement initiatives, maybe with risks, maybe with benchmarking. And we start to tell a story, because here we have some commentary, so we can go in, we can make comments and evaluations. So we start to tell a little bit more, maybe explain what these numbers mean, explain maybe some of the reasons behind these numbers, etc. We can give description views, explaining what this is for, why we have it, maybe show how this aligns, what other business units are also sharing these objectives. But it starts to tell a whole story where this objective isn't just a row in a table, it's a whole page, and it's a bit richer. So if we go into a KPI, we can start seeing the details of the KPI. We see the history across time, maybe the key figures. We see that we're in the red. And if we want more information, we don't overwhelm the user with throwing this on the front page, but we can see kind of the historical performance across time, maybe see how this is organizationally for the sub-organizations, etc. If we go out, again, we have a very clear navigation and breadcrumb, and we can link these up to things like initiatives or projects that might be linked to this objective. So again, it's not just measuring performance, it's about providing the means and a path, a roadmap, if you will, for how we can improve it. And our list of initiatives, even, these are rows and tables, but they can also be built out as their own pages. So if we navigate into one of these, we can see all of the related activities, maybe have a Gantt chart. If we're so inclined, we can have some sort of benefits realization model. We can talk about maybe the costing of this and put it into some sort of framework to evaluate whether this cost in the end will deliver its value back in terms of improved performance. Maybe these initiatives also impact other business units or other objectives. We can link those out as well. So we really start to tell the whole story. Maybe you want to have some sort of accountability. Maybe you have a sign off, or you want to hold people accountable for this. We see for a lot of customers that in the end, if a project doesn't go as planned, they start to play a real blame game and start pointing the fingers. But if they link up, how did we arrive at this decision? Well, we had Peter, Eric, and Alexander all signed off on this. We all agreed on this. We all agreed we were going to do this. It's here. We have an archive. But it starts to tell a story. It starts to glue things together a better way. And we can even link things out to things like risks as well. And it just depends on how far you want to take it. You can go into risks and you can have different risk reduction plans if you need to as well, and see how well these are functioning. But it starts to tell a really big story where you have something like an objective. It's linked to the KPIs. It's aligned organizationally. We have all of our commentary. It's linked to this cluster of initiatives or projects. It has these risks associated with it, and so on. That's, to me, how you start to tell a story. It's how you start to really deliver value back to business. I mean, of course, you can still have this kind of view where maybe you go into something like these kind of tables of KPIs. But this really only tells you a part of the story. I mean, in the end, you kind of need to click in here to understand more what's going on. But I think I need to leave a bit of time for some questions. So I think what I'll do is I think I'll drop off here, and I will leave this open to questions at this point.
All right, so we've so far already received a question. Beyond corporate performance measurement, what roles do KPIs play in measuring people?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is really up to how you know, the individual company wants to do things. I mean, we do have some customers that take KPIs down to team or individual employee level. So, I mean, there's that aspect of it. There's also some kind of hybrid systems. You know, that they're technically not KPIs, but you have things like OKRs, objectives and key results. That is becoming increasingly popular, especially in the United States. But what I normally see, I think in the most typical setup is rather than, you know, bringing these down to the individual level, what they will do is they will have objectives at the employee level where that employee is responsible, or they own it, or there's some sort of accountability baked in for the employee. It might not necessarily be a KPI that measures that employee's individual performance, but that employee will be somehow responsible for either the group or the team performance at that level. But again, you know, there's a lot of room for doing things the best way that fits what a company needs. The question is, how far does the company want to take this? How far do they want to micromanage down to the employee level, and so on? And that really varies.
All right. And now, in your opinion, what is a right time, a right moment to implement a KPI system after a company starts up? Would you say immediately, or say after 6 months or a year, and so on?
Yeah, I think I don't know that I can just, you know, give a blanket answer there, because I think what that really is dependent upon is the effort involved with reporting KPIs. If you have a small company and you can just stick your head out your office door and look down the hall and understand how the performance of it is going, you don't really need any sort of system at all. But if you have a very complex organization, or if, and again, it doesn't even have to do with the size of the organization, but you might have a company that's full of knowledge workers. I mean, they have a lot of data. They would be more likely to need a KPI system to organize it. But if you have a bunch of soft metrics, you can probably get by with just kind of tracking some of this stuff without taking any sort of data-driven approach. So again, it really varies, but I would suggest that when you hit a point where you're using one or two full, trying to track and report the KPIs for management, you probably, it's just more cost effective to use the solution.
And another question would be, do employees have access to this platform, or is it only for managers?
Again, this really varies by company. I mean, every company that we work with uses some rules for access control. You know, typically they control all or part of how people have access to the system. But there is a high degree of variability in how transparent organizations are in general. I mean, we've had some customers that want to be very transparent for the purpose of benchmarking, where they will rank different business units on some key metrics, and that's a way to encourage high performers to continue to improve, as well as motivating low performers to improve better, because their performance is much more public and they don't want to be on the bottom of that list. But again, it really varies from company to company, and as a flexible solution, and any solution of this type should have some level of access control, and it's really up to the framework, the way of motivating people and so on, how much access everybody has to everybody else's content.
All right. Now, another question that we received is, how can you ensure accurate goal cascading from strategic objectives down to the employee level in a balanced scorecard context? Are there any particular indicators or so on?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question, I mean, it's for most people, they want to visualize the cascade. And what we can do is this sort of thing where if you have something like an objective, we can see, you know, this has been cascaded to these business units, for instance. So you can visually see what is linked out where. So you can either do it in the tables, you can do it in reports. I mean, there's any number of ways of doing it. We've had some customers kind of have this, I don't know, it's like a matrix table that shows what goes where, you know, what's been linked out to what business units. It just depends on what style of visualization the customer wants. Are you there?
Yes.
Yep.
I was waiting for more questions. Right now, there aren't. We've received 2 more, but they require quite an in-depth answer from you. And I believe it would be much better to answer them via an email exchange with the person directly.
That sounds good.
We'll wait like a minute if anyone
Okay.
has any other questions. We received another question right now. In your opinion, who would be the best in terms of their job, in terms of their function within the company, to implement such a system?
That's an interesting question, because I've seen this owned by several different domains, management domains within different companies. I would say things that are very strategic or balanced scorecard-ish tend to be run from like some office of strategy management, if such a position exists. We've had several more pure KPI solutions that more resemble what you see in this demo, like oil and gas, where they have this kind of operations department that manages these types of systems or information. We've had some projects that really start more in continuous improvement. So it just really kind of depends on where that spark is, where organizationally this level of ownership resides. So I don't have just like a pure answer for this. Other times, though, I think if there's one trend, a lot of times this is ultimately owned by somebody in finance, but that's more at the managerial level. It's not operationally owned there. Some project owner internally is actually the solution owner for this sort of thing, but it was really up to finance to land a system and get it into place. But again, it really varies.
All right, now another question. Would you say that this solution also fits small and medium-sized enterprises?
Well, definitely for medium-sized enterprises. For small companies, you know, you have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, because we have some small customers that are very data-rich, or they're full of knowledge workers, and they get a lot of value out of that. But if it's a small company and they don't really have the resources to manage this, and they don't have ultimately the need for this level of complexity, they might be better off just managing things with Excel or using other solutions. But again, I think these terms like small and medium are very relative. You know, I think anything below 50 employees, I would say is quite small. And the medium, you know, can be like 50 to I don't know, 500 employees, and there you start to have a real need for some sort of solution.
Okay, now someone mentioned that there was an article saying that there have been a few companies throughout the world that have stopped using KPIs altogether. What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, what is a KPI in a way? I've seen a lot of other concepts emerge that are basically KPIs with a different name. I think this objectives and key results is one of those types of concepts that in a way there's a lot of similarities there. It's just how they are viewed, how the status is derived, how they tend to change over time, how target attainment is more binary. It's not like they don't really care if you reach 90% of your target. If you reach 90% of it, you didn't reach it. Is kind of the attitude there. But in a way, it's kind of rehashing the same kind of concepts. I also see, though, I would be amazed if a company completely eliminated KPIs, because I think a lot of times they have KPIs, but they don't call them that. I've seen a lot of companies that don't have any KPI system. They don't call it that. They don't call it a performance management system, but they have tons of data. They have tons of metrics and so on. But it's not linked together in any sort of well-defined framework. If anything, those types of companies are probably missing out on some opportunities and are probably not leveraging their data for all they can get. But coming back to it, I don't think KPIs alone are the answer. And I think for us and for our customers, it's not the focus. You know, the focus isn't on the KPI itself. The focus should be more on how are our activities doing, the things that we need to do to be better at our business, to compete better, to reduce our risks, etc. That's really, I think, where the management energy should be spent, and not spent on focusing on why a KPI was red instead of yellow or whatever. I mean, the KPI is just the measurement, and the management should be really on the things that the business can control and steer, like the activities and so on.
All right, and now one last question that we've received. Who would you believe is the suggested individual in the company that should record achievement and incidents data?
Achievement and incidents. I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about here, but what we normally see in large organizations is that you would have different data owners for different domains, different business units, and so on. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's one person who owns any of this. You know, your finance department would be in charge of the financial data. You might have an HR department that's really in charge of the HR data, like head count, absenteeism, and so on. You might have some HSEQ officer in charge of the health, safety, quality, environmental metrics. So you have these different data owners, and they're really the domain experts on this. If you're dealing with things like HSEQ, you can have industry benchmarks so that you know what your lost time injury rate should be, the frequency rate, and they're the expert at setting those kind of targets. If you're in finance, or let's say you're in sales, maybe you have some high-level sales targets, but then you need to kind of cascade this down, and you have to do some target setting exercise for all your sales managers so that they can meet this target. There's not one person. You wouldn't want the same person managing those kind of sales targets as somebody who's helping you with the HSEQ metrics. So I think it's important to have the right people owning these things. You probably want to have somebody that can tie things together from a systems perspective, so you can have a similar look and feel, so people don't just get totally lost as they switch from financial metrics into HSEQ metrics. But I think you really need a domain expert behind each one of these areas.
All right, that brings us to the end of our allotted time for the Q&A session. Eric, do you have any last words for our listeners?
My only last words are just to thank everybody for attending, and just to express my appreciation.
Thank you very much once again for your presentation.